Talk Politics with Governor Mike Beebe is brought to you by the Arkansas State Chamber of Commerce and Associated Industries of Arkansas, because business matters. Impact Management Group, Public Relations and Public Affairs, over a decade of issue advocacy success. Connect Arkansas, empowering entrepreneurs and Arkansans through greater utilization of the Internet. And ConwayArkansas.org. Get smart. Visit ConwayArkansas.org and see why Conway is the smart choice for business, education, and more.
All right, welcome to this latest edition of Talk Politics. I'm Roby Brock. We are with Governor Mike Beebe, who's going to answer your questions today. We've got a lot of them in queue already. If you want to send some more questions to us, you can do it through Twitter or through Facebook. Make sure you use the Talk Politics hashtag. That'll be the best way to get it in queue. Governor, thank you for being with us.
Surely.
We appreciate you being here.
Surely.
Let's get straight to a couple of questions that we've had in advance here. First question is from Alex from Springdale via email. It's a redistricting question. He asked that the latest census shows that the Hispanic population is the fastest growing minority in Arkansas. There's discussion of creating a state representative district where Hispanics are a majority or would have a sizable population. Would you support a map that would include that?
We're looking at precisely that. You've got 2 or 3 issues that we don't yet have a handle on. I don't know that there could be a majority district based upon the preliminary numbers we've seen. There certainly could be an influence district based upon a significant population. And that's one of the options I think that we're trying to explore. One of the real hurdles we have trying to figure this out is the number of Hispanics in a proposed district that are here legally but can't vote. So you wonder whether or not the actual population numbers translates, how close does that translate to voting numbers, and then therefore what effect would it have anyway. But I think it's an option on the table. I think my staff's looking at that. I know our staffs talk. The constitutional officers don't talk because it would violate the open meetings law if we privately talked about it. So the staffs have been exchanging data and information. I think there have been several maps that have been drawn and that have been played with and are over at the office of the redistricting office for people to be able to go look at or talk about. And that certainly is an option we're looking seriously at, and I may well support it depending upon what the demographics show and whether or not it's feasible. What
do you think of the criticism that has come from the potential support for a district like that? Is it fair? Is it founded?
Well, just all in the eyes of the beholder. Some people don't think you ought to have districts that accommodate any ethnic group, whether it's any minority group or anything else for that matter. And other people believe that for proper representation that you can provide influence districts or majority districts. We've always been able to do that in the past, and I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be trying to do that going forward if it's fair and if it's reasonable.
When do you think that we will see some final maps that might be voted upon? Is there a date that you have in mind?
Yes, yes, and I think we've announced it, but as we sit here talking about it, I can't give you the specific dates. I know that we have publicly indicated a need to have maps out there toward that last week of July for people to be able to comment on, and then have another public meeting for people to be able to actually comment on the specific maps, and then subsequent to that final public meeting come to a vote. I think we're shooting for like July 29th or 30th, somewhere in that range, to have a meeting. A meeting date's been set, but I think it's the 29th of July.
Let's move on to another question here about the University of Arkansas, which is looking for a new president there to replace B. Allen Sugg. There's 4 picks that have been announced as final candidates. This question comes from Matt via email. Do you have a favorite of those 4, and will you exercise any influence on the selection? Are you satisfied with the process?
Number one, if I had a favorite, I'm not going to publicly announce it or try to publicly get into a discussion about who I favor or don't favor. I've read the biographies of all 4 of them. Certainly, if a member of the board asks me what I know about any one of the 4, I'm more than happy to comment. I have not tried to interject myself into the selection process. I've not tried to influence overtly, except in response to what a board member may call me and ask me about the process. I trust the board to select the best person.
So maybe I could ask this question a little differently. What candidate of the four might you have the most to say something positive about?
Well, we won't get into that either.
All right, I tried. Let's move over. We had several questions through Twitter. I'm just going to kind of capsulize a few of them here. This deals with the House District 54 race going over in East Arkansas.
Sure.
You've endorsed the Democrat,
Yes.
Hudson Hallam, in that race.
Right.
There has been some controversy over allegations of voter fraud. You've not commented on those charges. Why not? What's your take?
Well, I don't know anything about them other than what I've read in the paper, that there are allegations. And in response to that, I think there's been heightened scrutiny, and people are watching the election process, and monitors, I think, are engaged in ensuring that there's no improper or inappropriate activity. Anytime anybody makes an allegation that there is impropriety in a voting process, I think it's the state's responsibility to react by, number one, investigating what the allegations are fairly and honestly with the appropriate people. And as I understand it, state police are doing that. Although I haven't been directly involved in that, I think I read where the state police are doing that. They don't need my approval to go investigate complaints. That's their regular job, and they're supposed to do their regular job, and I expect them to do their regular job. But in addition to investigating any allegations of impropriety, in addition to that, they need to make sure that going forward that they properly monitor the election process to ensure the integrity of the voters' wishes and wills. I assume that's going on. You get a lot of this stuff, depends on whose ox is getting gored as to whether or not someone wants to complain. Sometimes there's truth to the complaints. Sometimes irregularities exist which need to be investigated and eradicated. Sometimes they're sour grapes and they're not valid points. Nobody knows until you do an honest, objective investigation, and that's all anybody can ask for.
There have been, I guess this is kind of a high-profile race just because there's nothing else really going on election-wise at this point in time. Do you think that a Republican victory or a Democrat victory will signal something specific about the electorate based on what the outcome of this race is?
Well, I mean, that's kind of hard to say. It depends on what happens. It's traditionally a Democratic area, and the Democratic candidate would be just as favored in that race as a Republican would be in another part of the state that was traditionally Republican. It's complicated here because you've got a third-party candidate, an independent candidate, who has actually worked for me and worked had been a Democrat and worked in Democratic circles. To the extent that that vote gets split and influences it, no, I don't think it says anything. To the extent that the Democrat wins, I don't think it says anything. If the Republican were to win without it being the result of a third-party candidate, then that might say something.
Okay. Did Mr. Rogers work for you at one point?
Yeah, worked in, well, I think he was one of our field coordinators in the gubernatorial race.
This question comes from James via email. This is actually a federal question, but your reaction to it, because there'll be some state implications. What advice would you give to Congress and to the President in regard to the U.S. perhaps defaulting and being unable to pay its bills or obligations, obviously in reference to the debt ceiling debate going on? And if that scenario actually occurred, what might you do as governor to quell potential public panic, if there were any?
Well, I think there could be potential global public panic if the United States defaulted. You know, Arkansas suffered for decades because during the Depression we were the only state that defaulted. I mean, it's a terrible legacy, and I think it lingered with us for up until just the recent history, where we've started to change our national image and where people are now bragging on Arkansas and thinking we're one of the leaders in the country rather than so many followers. I think to some extent, part of that's the legacy of having defaulted and the legacy of being the only state that defaulted during the Great Depression. Just magnify that if the federal government does that. Apparently the economic instability that would cause across the globe, apparently what that would do to people's IRAs and 401ks, to all the retirement systems that people rely on, what that would do to stock prices, what that would do to job creation, what that would do to the private sector. I mean, a lot of it, I guess, is educated analysis by people who know a lot about all this stuff, but there seems to be a consensus from the left and from the right and from the folks in the middle that would be some of the ramifications. So it seems to me like, I think Geithner said it yesterday, failure is not an option there. And now, you don't expect everybody just to cave in, one side to totally cave into the other side, but these people better get together. I mean, the American people expect them to get together. Our system is set up in a fashion that one side doesn't get everything they want all the time, and nobody wins every war. But the people will lose if they don't figure this stuff out. What can we do as a state? Well, we'll do the best we can to continue to monitor our own operations in a fashion that maximizes our ability to pay our bills, pay our debts, provide services. As you pointed out several times, we've been one of 4 states. Now we're one of 8. The good news is 4 more states have joined the ranks of solvency and fiscal responsibility. But that means 42 states haven't, which means there's still major problems out there. And we're not immune, so that if this default occurs in the national economy, triggers a global collapse, economic collapse, then we're certainly going to get our fair share of the catastrophic results from that. So we're not going to be able to withstand by ourselves a global meltdown if all the prognostications are correct about what the ramifications would be of defaulting on our debt.
But you guys have not had any cabinet level discussions or any internal staff discussions about we might ought to get a game plan together?
Oh, we've had a lot of internal staff discussions, absolutely, and we practice scenarios on lots of things. Everybody knows that we practice scenarios on disasters. We also practice scenarios on what adjustments would need to be made in the event of an economic downturn, either on just the state level or on this. This is so catastrophic, it's akin to what would happen on the emergency response level if New Madrid had a major earthquake. I mean, this is so big. A potential national default is so big, there's not a lot most states can do to affect change in that regard.
Are there some things that you can point to that you would do, though, or that you might have to do to, react to that type of scenario?
Well, one of the things we may have to do is be able to properly plug in our rainy day funds. And I do have more flexibility, but that's pretty limited too. So I don't want to speculate. I think it's too early to speculate on that. I don't want to fuel additional speculative fire. I don't want to create a headline that says Arkansas will go X, Y, Z in the event of a national default. We will do the best we can to weather that storm if that storm occurs. But everybody needs to understand the people in Washington need to get busy and solve this problem, and they need to do it in some spirit of cooperation. Now, I tell a story, Roby, and it's a great story. It's a total bipartisan story, and it happens to be true about Erskine Bowles. And Erskine Bowles was Clinton's chief of staff when Clinton was president, and the House and the Senate were controlled by the Republicans. Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House, and Trent Lott was the Republican Majority Leader in the Senate. And so Clinton sent Erskine Bowles to sit down with the leaders of the Congress to try to get a handle on the deficit, what everybody's so concerned about now in the mid-'90s. And they didn't trust each other for several weeks, and they didn't get much done, and they were waiting for somebody to go run to the press or run out and beat their chests and throw stones or claim victory or whatever the case would be. They figured out after several weeks that nobody was doing that maybe they could trust each other. And they sat down and they actually, in a bipartisan way, Democratic chief of staff of the White House, the Republican leader of the House, and the Republican leader of the Senate, and they worked out a plan that ultimately resulted in 4 years worth of hundreds of billions of dollars of budget surpluses, all going on that national debt, and with projections that we would be out of national debt for the first time since Andrew Jackson, I think, had the things progressed after Clinton left office in the same fashion for another 3 or 4 years. It can be done, but it requires leadership and bipartisan work and folks kind of putting down their political hats for a second and getting together and doing what needs to be done, which is to work for Americans. I mean, that's who they work for. They work for the people of America.
Well, we've got a couple of state budget questions, so let's use
Sure.
that as a segue.
Sure.
This one comes from Schroeder DW on Twitter. I'm not sure who that is. Shouldn't the $94 million state budget surplus go back to taxpayers, perhaps based on a share-paid basis?
No, not in my opinion. I think they said if it was not on a share pay basis, but on a per capita basis, it's $32 is what people would get. Look, I've got a track record of cutting taxes. No Republican, no Democrat, no independent in the history of Arkansas as governor has led more, fought for more, and actually obtained more tax cuts than we have in 4.5 years. Primarily through the grocery tax, but not just the grocery tax. So I got some credibility to talk about giving taxpayers their money back. At the same time, we got a fiscal ship to run, and we're one of 4 states. We were one of 4. We're in one of 8 now that are not in financial trouble. That $94 million undoubtedly is going to be needed. It's one-time money is what it amounts to now, because it's in effect the surplus that was gathered as surplus. That undoubtedly will be needed to plug holes, whether it's to keep a rapist in prison, to keep from having to do what California did, to let, in case things don't go as quickly in our prison reform as we hope, whether it's for Medicaid, which is going to be in serious trouble, even if we make some reforms that try to hold costs down. The projections for Medicaid is that we're going to go in the hole. Every politician wants to give more money back in the form of tax relief. It's good politics from the standpoint of getting yourself elected. What's better politics is managing your budget in a way that your state's not one of all those in trouble, so that our whole financial house is in a wreck. Arkansas is in good shape, and I intend to keep her that way.
Another question, you cited that tax cuts were a reason for this problem. This comes from Patrick via our content partner, the City Wire in Fort Smith. Have you had second thoughts about the cuts to foster care that were pinned on tax cuts? Are you seeking a solution or sticking with the DHS decision?
Well, everybody except K through 12 took a reduction in what their budget was going to call for, because of the additional tax cuts over and above what was in the balanced budget. I proposed tax cuts for an additional ½ cent. That was figured into the balanced budget. When the legislature passed additional tax cuts, which I went along with, I'm as much to blame or whatever as the legislature. In fairness, we had to build a firewall and accept some additional tax cuts to keep from having over $100 million in tax cuts, which would have done a whole lot more in terms of reduction of foster care payments over and above what we've seen. But nobody was exempt from the cuts except K through 12. And what people have to understand is that that's half our budget, K through public education. And under the Constitution, under the Supreme Court, under the law, they don't get cut. So that means 100% of all the tax cuts come from 50% of everybody who receives benefits, which makes it disproportionate. And human services was no exception. Will we look at ways to try to shore that up going forward, particularly if we can plug in some rainy day money to... All those options are always on the table, and I look at all those options. But what you have to do going forward is plan for a balanced budget and plan for spending that doesn't exceed the forecasted revenues. Everybody applauds, well, not everybody, almost everybody applauds the fact that we are one of 4 doing things right and not running in the hole. And people can say, well, you got to. That's the Constitution. Every state, I think, except Vermont, has to have a balanced budget. And yet they still have these huge problems. And they end up balancing their budget, either by borrowing money or by taking it from retirement systems or by delaying some payments or by just huge cuts in services. We haven't had to do that at this point. And so part of the reason that we've been in this shape is that we've had to make these tough calls sometimes, and nobody likes those cuts. I certainly don't like those cuts, but it's one of the areas that you have to look at.
But you don't see addressing that foster care situation until the fiscal session?
Not necessarily. I have some discretion in rainy day monies, but we don't have that much rainy day money. We can't run out the first month of the fiscal year and devote everything there. Then what happens if the state hospital gets closed for the mentally ill. As we've seen the problems in that regard, and we don't have anything there. What happens if the prison runs out of money and we have to start letting folks out like they did in California? So, I mean, you have to manage all this stuff, and I'm very conservative about the way I manage it, and we'll do the best we can to minimize the negative effects on some of our services. But cuts are inevitable when you've got to balance a budget, and they created more tax cuts, and I accepted more tax cuts than was originally proposed in the balanced budget. Part of it, I did it too.
All right, let's go to Jill from Conway. This question comes via email. Your recent decision to appear before the Stonewall Democrats created some controversy in the media and among some of your supporters who had not heard you articulate your views on civil unions and equal rights for those in the gay and lesbian community in such a direct way before. Were you surprised by the discussion that ensued after your appearance? Do you see your comments as a reflection of your personal beliefs or merely a commentary on the current political environment surrounding those issues? Do you regret going?
Well, that's a good question. There's some days I regret going. No, they asked me to come. I think it was important that I go. They knew before I got there what my position was on same-sex marriage. I was opposed and am opposed to same-sex marriage. Where some of the controversy, I think, got a little heated beyond what I expected was with regard to some of the discrimination issues. And, frankly, I guess people think I know everything about everything. Discrimination of folks in the workplace, in the work environment, is not appropriate, and some views got or some discussion ensued about that I thought was different than what I'd actually said. People do change, and sometimes they do evolve, but I tried to answer the questions honestly about what I thought. Part of it was what I thought was going to happen based on the political environment. Part of it was my own personal opinion and beliefs. The majority of the folks that invited me there, while they disagreed with me on some of the issues, were very respectful and very kind about the way everything went down. There were others that were less than kind, and you're always going to. You can't make everybody happy. You can't make everybody. And I used to try to do that. Some people said that was one of Bill Clinton's big downfalls. He wanted everybody to love him. Well, everybody doesn't love you. Everybody doesn't love me. All you can do is tell people what you think and then live with the consequences.
But you were not surprised by the discussion that ensued
after
that. So you knew it would be somewhat of a controversy.
Sure, I knew when I went. Yeah, in fact, I joked about it when I went and made a few opening comments about the economy, about the budget, about prison reform, and I said, I guess that's what you all wanted me to come talk about, and see you all later. And of course, that broke the crowd up, and everybody laughed because they knew, and I knew, that there was going to be questions and answers, and there were going to be pointed questions, and it was going to be exactly what it was.
We've got a couple questions on the severance tax here. First of all, this one just came in during the program here. Mm-hmm. What's the governor's position on Sheffield Nelson's severance tax proposal?
Well, I always believe that people ought to be able to vote on it. I thought that we accomplished what we needed to accomplish with regard to trying to fashion a reasonable severance tax when we had none before. Now, the folks that wanted more severance tax, like what Mr. Nelson is proposing, thought, well, we got too little and we got rookie dude. Again, you got to put all this stuff in context. And at the time, we had no severance tax, and we fought and it took 3/4 votes in both houses to get a severance tax. And we went from nothing, I think $600,000 a year in income on natural gas severance tax, to even at lower gas price levels, something in the $50 million a year level. So that's what I committed to at the time. But I certainly have no objection to folks being able to vote on a higher one. I'm not going to get out there in the middle of it and try to pass or defeat Mr. Nelson's proposal. the people being able to vote on it's fine. I think they need to weigh what does this do in terms of further activity. If it doesn't hurt further activity and gives us more money, then that's obviously a nice thing. If it does hurt further activity and impinges on employment, then that's something else to think about. I don't know that anybody knows the answer to that yet, but I expect over the course of the next several months, now that it's going to be on the ballot, we're going to see a lot of discussion on that, and people will be able to make up their minds about it.
You're neutral on it right now?
Yeah.
Okay. This question comes from Cliff via Facebook. How did the state of Arkansas's Game and Fish Commission sell mineral rights of our state parks and land without a public vote?
Really, really, really good question. And, you know, one of the things that I would have loved to have had those monies from the Game and Fish mineral rights into some critical areas like foster care. We went over and tried to get them, and they did commit some money to general purposes. The people of the state of Arkansas a number of years ago passed a constitutional amendment that created constitutional independence to get them out of politics. I mean, that was what they said at the time. So the Game and Fish Commission has more autonomy, and this land belongs to the people, but I mean it's housed within the title to it's with the Game and Fish. And I think the courts, or at least the legal opinion, ruled that they didn't have to go to the legislature or a vote of the people, that they were charged with that responsibility, and that they got the right to be able to lease the land, and more importantly, they got the right to keep the money for their purposes, for game and fish and conservation wildlife purposes. Could we use some of that money for critical areas? Yeah, but apparently legally the legislature or the governor doesn't have a lot to say about it.
Last question for you here. This comes from Carlton via Twitter. Is Shane Broadway, in your opinion, the best person in the country to run the Department of Higher Education? Was there a search?
No, there hadn't been a search. In my opinion, he's the best person to run this department at this time. Yes, we had a pretty good search last time. We got a really smart guy. But if you'll talk to the colleges and universities and some of the other folks, there was a difficulty in communication. There was difficulty in communicating with legislators, with colleges, with boards of trustees, with presidents. And Jim was a good man. I hired him, or recommended his hiring. Actually, the board hired him. So, I mean, there's something good to be said about a search, a national search, and getting somebody who has all the credentials from all over the place. And there's something to be said for somebody who understands the various constituencies that play such an important role in the continued progress and development of our higher education system. One's not necessarily right and one's not necessarily wrong. It depends on the circumstances and the time and the personalities. Obviously, I think Shane can do a good job, or I wouldn't have recommended to the board that they hire him. We'll see what the board has to say. It's come under criticism because he's only had, 6 months or something like that, first as a deputy director and then as an interim director, and whether or not that legally meets the qualifications of a statute in terms of having the requisite experience in higher education. Obviously I believe that he's the right man, or I wouldn't have made that recommendation.
You understand the criticism, though.
Sure I do. Knew what the criticism was going to be when we did it.
All right, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talk Business, or Talk Politics, our question and answer session with the governor. Thank you so much for participating.
Good to be.
We appreciate you.
Good to see you, Rob.
Thank you so much for participating. We appreciate your questions. I'm Roby Brock. We'll see you next time.